I remember the taste of my mother's bread, sweet honey and grain from the southern fields of Vidia Prime, baked in the early hours before the work bells rang across our settlement. The memory returns to me now as I stand within the armoring chambers of the fortress monastery, watching crimson paint dry upon my ceramite plates. 437 years have passed since I last tasted bread. 437 years since I was called anything other than Brother Cassius of the Blood Ravens' 3rd Company. They tell the children of the Imperium that we are angels, living gods wrapped in blessed armor, descended from the Emperor's own genetic legacy to protect humanity from the darkness between the stars. In their picture books and cathedral murals, we shine like silver saints, our bolters singing hymns of righteousness as we cut through heretic and alien alike. The propaganda feeds speak of our glory, our honor, our eternal vigilance. But what they never speak of is the price. They never tell you that to become an angel, you must first learn to forget that you were ever human. I was 11 when the chaplain came to our world. 11 years old, playing war games in the agricultural fields with my younger brother Matthias, while our parents worked the harvest lines. The sky that day was the color of burnished copper, heavy with the promise of rain that would never come. The drought had lasted 6 months, and yet the planetary governor's tithes remained unchanged. People whispered words that would have earned them a flogging in the capital. But in the outer settlements, desperation breeds loose tongues. Then came the thunder, not the rumble of weather, but something deeper, more mechanical. Matthias and I climbed the tallest grain tower in our sector to see. Our small hands gripped the rusted ladder rungs as we ascended toward the sound. What we saw changed everything. Drop pods, 12 of them, descending through the atmosphere like falling stars, their retro thrusters carving bright scars across the copper sky. They struck the earth in perfect formation, each impact crater precisely calculated to surround our settlement without harming the harvest infrastructure. When the smoke cleared and the ramps lowered, they emerged. Space Marines of the Blood Ravens chapter. Even at 11, even as a simple agri-world child who had never seen anything more threatening than a pack of feral groks, I knew what they were. Every citizen of the Imperium knows the Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's Chosen, the Angels of Death. But seeing them in person, watching them stride through our settlement with their massive frames casting long shadows across the dust, I felt something I had never expected. Terror. They were too large, too perfect, too far removed from anything human. Their armor hummed with embedded hymns as they moved, each footstep creating tremors in the earth beneath us. When they spoke, their voices carried the mechanical resonance of vox amplifiers, turning simple words into pronouncements from on high. They had come for recruitment, they announced. The chapter required new aspirants, and Vidia Prime had been chosen for the honor of contributing to the Emperor's armies. My mother wept when they called my name, not tears of joy, as the settlement administrator proclaimed, but tears of loss, the kind that spoke of endings rather than glory. She knew somehow what the rest of us were only beginning to understand. Her son would leave that day, but he would never return. The thing that came back, if anything came back at all, would wear his face but carry none of his heart. The selection was swift and merciless. Physical examinations, genetic screening, psychological evaluation of the 300 children aged 10 to 12, only 7 passed the requirements. I was among them. Matthias was not. I still remember the look in his eyes as the chaplain's servo skull completed his biological scan and moved on. Relief and disappointment warred within him, and I found myself envying him, even as pride swelled in my chest. We were allowed no farewells, no final meals, no last nights in our homes. The chaplain explained that attachment to our former lives would only weaken us in the trials ahead. We were no longer children of Vidia Prime. We were aspirants of the Blood Ravens, servants of the Emperor. Our old identities had become irrelevant. The journey to the chapter's fortress monastery took 3 months aboard a massive battle barge called the Litany of Fury. 3 months in the ship's lower decks, crammed into dormitories with aspirants from dozens of other worlds. Farmers, gang fighters from hive cities, tribal warriors from death worlds, and noble-born youths from civilized planets. The chapter cast its net wide, seeking not just strength, but genetic compatibility with the gene seed of their Primarch. During that voyage, we learned our first true lesson: expendability. Of the 47 aspirants who had boarded the ship, only 32 survived. Some died from failed medical procedures as the ship's apothecaries began the early stages of organ implantation. Others succumbed to constant combat training, their bones shattered under the brutal conditioning meant to prepare us for the impossible. A few simply broke, their minds unable to comprehend the magnitude of what they were becoming. Those were the fortunate ones. They died quickly. The fortress monastery of the Blood Ravens sits upon a moon called Aurelia's Grief, orbiting a dead star forgotten by Imperial cartographers. A structure of impossible scale, carved from living rock and reinforced with adamantium bulkheads strong enough to withstand orbital bombardment. Gothic spires reach toward the void like grasping fingers, each housing training chambers, meditation cells, and relics gathered from 10,000 years of war. Walking its halls for the first time, I felt the weight of history pressing down upon me. Countless aspirants had walked these same corridors, and most had died before earning the right to call themselves Astartes. The walls themselves seemed to whisper of failure and sacrifice, of boys who had dreamed of becoming angels and found only death waiting in the dark. The true trials began immediately. They called it the Proving, though I would later learn it was merely the first of many tests designed to break us down and rebuild us into something unrecognizable. For 6 months, we endured physical conditioning that would have killed fully grown men. We ran obstacle courses in powered armor too heavy for our young frames. We fought servitors programmed to maim rather than merely defeat. We memorized the Codex Astartes until we could recite tactical doctrines in our sleep, and were tested while enduring pain that would drive most adults mad. Of the 32 aspirants who arrived on Aurelia's Grief, only 18 survived the first month. The rest were interred in unmarked graves deep beneath the monastery, their names recorded but never spoken again. We were forbidden to mourn. Grief, they told us, was weakness. Attachment was failure. Those who resisted were subjected to additional conditioning: drugs, hypno-indoctrination, even surgical modification of the brain. I learned to stop caring about the names of the boys who vanished. It was survival, but it was also something more fundamental: a slow, necessary amputation of empathy. The first organ implantation came at the end of our initial training: the secondary heart, a backup system that would allow us to survive wounds fatal to normal men. The surgery took place deep within the monastery, in operating theaters that dated back to the days of the Great Crusade. Ancient machinery hummed with sacred power as apothecaries prepared their instruments. Servo arms moved with mechanical precision as they opened my chest and began reshaping my body. I was conscious throughout. They said pain was part of the process, that learning to function through agony was essential for any space marine. They were right. Over the centuries that followed, I would be shot, burned, crushed, and poisoned more times than I could count. The ability to compartmentalize pain would save my life again and again, but it would also cost me something I didn't even realize I was losing, until it was already gone. The months that followed were a blur of surgeries and escalating trials. The osmodular, which strengthened our bones until they could turn aside chainsawed blades. The bisco, which enhanced our muscle density and reaction time beyond human limits. The Haymaster implants, which improved our blood's oxygen-carrying capacity and allowed us to survive in environments that would asphyxiate normal humans. Each implant brought us closer to the chapter's ideal, but further from the children we had once been. I stopped dreaming about my mother's bread during this period. I stopped dreaming about Matthias, about the copper sky of Vidia Prime, about anything that connected me to my previous existence. The chapter's conditioning programs were designed to sever these ties, to create warriors who would serve the Emperor without the distraction of personal loyalties or emotional attachments. They were remarkably effective. By the time I received my 13th organ implant, the catalepsian node that allowed me to remain alert even during periods of rest, I had forgotten what it felt like to miss home. I had forgotten that I had ever had a home at all. The black carapace was the final implantation, the interface that would allow me to merge with the machine spirits of power armor and weapons. It was also the most dangerous. Of the 11 aspirants who had survived to that point, 4 died during the procedure. Their bodies rejected the synthetic material. They expired in agony as their immune systems turned on the foreign tissue. We watched them die in the recovery chambers, convulsing as carapace toxins spread through their bloodstreams. I felt nothing as they screamed. Nothing at all. This absence of feeling was the truest sign that my transformation was complete. I had become something that could watch children die without grief or compassion, something that could witness suffering and remain focused on tactical objectives. I had become what the Imperium needed me to be. I had become a weapon. The ceremony that marked my full induction into the Blood Ravens took place in the chapter's Reclusium, a vast cathedral chamber carved from black stone and lit by thousands of devotional candles. Chaplain Mauricus spoke the words of binding, the oath that would tie my soul to the chapter's service for whatever remained of my existence. I knelt before the altar of the Emperor and swore to defend humanity against its enemies, to serve the throne without question, and to die rather than allow dishonor to stain the chapter's name. When I rose from that altar, I was no longer the farm boy from Vidia Prime. I was Brother Cassius, battle brother of the Blood Ravens' 3rd Company, servant of the Emperor of mankind. The name I had been given at birth was recorded in the chapter archives, but never spoken aloud. That person had died during the transformation. What emerged in his place was something new, purposeful, efficient, and hollowed of those things that had once made him human. My first combat deployment came 3 months later aboard the strike cruiser Righteous Fury. Our destination was a forge world called Metallica 7, where reports indicated a possible chaos incursion threatening the planet's industrial output. The journey took 6 weeks through the warp. 6 weeks that gave me my first true taste of what existence as an Astartes would entail. Training. Constant. Relentless. Endless training. We practiced boarding actions in the ship's mock-up corridors, fought room-to-room battles against servitors programmed with enemy patterns, and studied psychological profiles until we could predict heretic behavior with mathematical accuracy. We maintained our equipment with devotional care, learning that every bolt, every power cell, every piece of kit was a sacred tool in the Emperor's service. We prayed, we meditated, and we readied our minds for the certainty of violence waiting on every world we would visit. Above all, we learned to function as a unit. Individual identity, the sergeants told us, was a luxury the Adeptus could not afford. We were not 11 separate warriors seeking personal glory. We were a single weapon with 11 components, each expendable if its sacrifice served the greater tactical objective. This doctrine was hammered into us through combat simulations that randomly designated squad members as casualties, forcing survivors to adapt tactics on the fly without showing emotional response. I learned to watch a squad mate die and immediately reassess firing angles to maximize our remaining firepower. I learned to step over bodies without breaking stride if the mission required forward momentum. I learned to strip ammunition and equipment from corpses when supplies ran low, treating remains as battlefield resources rather than the shells of men I had trained with for months. These skills were necessary. They would save lives and secure entire worlds, but they came at the cost the recruitment posters never mention: a gradual erosion of the things that had once made me capable of human connection. Metallica 7 was a world of perpetual industrial twilight, its skies choked with the exhaust of 10,000 manufactorums. The surface lay buried beneath rocket and steel. The chaos incursion had begun in the planetary capital's lower industrial sectors, where reports suggested factory workers had taken to forbidden rituals involving the machine spirits of their equipment. Word and blade units had been dispatched to investigate, but their Vox feeds had gone dark 3 days before our arrival. Our mission was simple: investigate the source of the disturbance, eliminate any heretical influences, and restore the planet's manufacturing capacity to acceptable levels. The lives of individual workers were considered acceptable losses if their sacrifice preserved the Forge world's strategic value to the wider war effort. We made planetfall during the world's artificial night cycle, when manufactorums reduced output to conserve reactor fuel. Our drop pods struck the industrial sector's main thoroughfare with precision, each impact calculated to minimize infrastructure damage while providing optimal positions for urban combat. When the ramps lowered and we stepped into sulfur-tainted air, I tasted the first true flavor of real warfare. The silence was wrong. Metallica 7 should have thundered with industrial noise. Instead, the streets lay empty and still, save for the distant hum of automated systems. Warning runes flickered from voxcasters mounted on corridor walls, broadcasting quarantine protocols and mandatory curfews. The air itself tasted of metal and corruption, a scent my enhanced olfactory systems identified as human decomposition mixed with something alien that no Imperial database could name. Brother Sergeant Thalen raised his fist to signal halt as we approached the first manufactorum complex. Through reinforced windows, we saw movement in the shadows, human shapes moving with coordinated, deliberate patterns rather than panic. They were waiting for us. They had been waiting long enough to prepare. The first fire came from elevated positions, autoguns sending rounds that spat harmlessly off our ceramite while revealing enemy locations. They were indeed factory workers, but altered, flesh grafted to machine in blasphemous configurations that violated every principle of orthodox Imperial technology. Their faces bore mutations that betrayed exposure to warp energies. We responded with disciplined bolter fire. Our weapons sang hymns of purification as mass reactive rounds found their marks. The corrupted workers fell quickly. But for every cultist that died, 2 more emerged from the shadows. They were organized. They had prepared. The battle raged 4 hours, and carried us through 17 industrial complexes before we reached the source. In the deepest levels of the primary manufactorum, we found what remained of a word-bearer infiltration team. They had established a shrine to the Dark Mechanicus in the reactor chamber, using the Forge World's own power systems to amplify blasphemous rites. The shrine itself was a fusion of flesh and corrupted machinery that hurt to behold, a writhing mass pulsing with malevolent energy. Before it stood a vessel that had once been human, now hollowed and repurposed by powers that dwell in the warp. It spoke to us through the voices of dead workers, promising knowledge beyond the Omnissiah's limited understanding, power beyond the crude augmentations of our gene seed. It offered visions of what we could become if we abandoned loyalty to the corpse emperor and embraced the truth of chaos. I felt nothing as I raised my bolter and put 6 mass reactive rounds through its center mass. Nothing except satisfaction at the completion of our mission parameters. The corrupted thing collapsed into flesh and metal, its death cry echoing through the reactor as the shrine's power source flickered and died. With the focal point destroyed, the corruption that had spread through Metallica 7's industrial sector would wither. The planet's manufacturing capacity could be restored within standard parameters. We had won our first victory. We had served the Emperor. We had protected the Imperium from the influence of chaos. Everything had proceeded exactly as our training had prepared us to expect. But as we prepared to extract from the facility, Brother Varian made an observation that would haunt me for decades afterward. The corrupted workers, he noted, had fought with desperate courage, even though they faced impossible odds. They had died defending something they believed in, something that had given their lives meaning beyond mere survival. Their corruption had been absolute, their damnation certain, but they had died with purpose. We, by contrast, had killed them efficiently and without emotion. We had served our function perfectly, but we had felt nothing while doing so. No anger at their heresy, no satisfaction at their defeat, no grief for the lives they had wasted in service to dark powers. We had simply eliminated them because our orders required it, the same way we might repair a damaged piece of equipment or clean the barrel of a bolter. This realization should have troubled me, but it didn't. I had been conditioned to see this emotional emptiness as strength rather than loss. Yet sometimes, in the quiet moments between missions, I would find myself wondering what it might feel like to care about something enough to die for it. To believe in something so deeply that death seemed preferable to abandonment of that belief. I would never know. The conditioning that had made me an effective warrior had also made me incapable of that kind of faith. I served the Emperor because I had been programmed to serve, not because I had chosen to believe. I fought chaos because my orders required it, not because I understood why their influence was worth opposing. I protected humanity not from love, but from duty. And duty without love is simply obedience to authority. This is what they don't tell you about becoming a space marine. Yes, you gain strength beyond human limits. Yes, you acquire weapons and armor that make you nearly invincible against conventional threats. Yes, you become part of something larger and more significant than any individual could hope to achieve alone. But you lose the ability to choose your own path. You lose the capacity for doubt, for questioning, for the kind of independent thought that might lead you to make decisions based on personal conviction rather than institutional obligation. You lose the ability to form meaningful relationships with other human beings because you are no longer human yourself. You become a tool in service of an ideal that you can no longer truly comprehend because you lack the emotional capacity to to understand what makes that ideal worth preserving. The campaigns that followed Metallica 7th blended together into a continuous cycle of violence and victory. Orc incursions on agri-worlds, where we slaughtered greenskins by the thousands while the local populations cheered our arrival. Tau expeditions on industrial planets, where we fought running battles against pulse rifle formations and battlesuits that could match our power armor pound for pound. Tyrannid swarms on death worlds, where we held defensive positions until ammunition ran low, then continued fighting with combat knives and bare hands until reinforcements arrived, or we died in the attempt. Each campaign taught me new lessons about warfare, about tactics, about the countless ways the enemies of the Imperium could be killed or neutralized. I learned to read battlefield conditions at a glance, to adapt our squad's firing patterns, to maximize casualties while conserving ammunition. I learned to identify weak points in enemy formations and exploit them with surgical precision. I learned to fight in every environment, from the vacuum of space to the crushing depths of ocean trenches, against every kind of threat, from mindless beasts to strategic masterminds who could anticipate our movements and counter them with equal skill. But I never learned to care about the people we were supposedly protecting. The billions of Imperial citizens who lived and died according to the outcomes of our battles remained abstract concepts, assets rather than individuals worthy of personal concern. They were strategic resources to be preserved when possible and acceptable losses when necessary. Nothing more, nothing less. This emotional detachment served me well when we were deployed to suppress rebellions on civilized worlds. Worlds where Imperial citizens had been led astray by charismatic leaders who promised them better lives if they threw off the yoke of Imperial taxation and regulation. Worlds where families fought against our arrival because they genuinely believed that independence would serve their children better than submission to the Imperium. On Castellan IV, we fought through residential districts where every building had been turned into a fortress by citizens who had decided that death was preferable to surrender. They used furniture as barricades, kitchen knives as weapons, and their own children as human shields, because they knew that we would not hesitate to fire through civilian casualties to reach our tactical objectives. They were right. We didn't hesitate. We couldn't. The conditioning that had stripped away our capacity for empathy had also eliminated our ability to recognize the moral complexity of situations where good people found themselves on the wrong side of Imperial policy. I killed a woman on Castellan Forn who was trying to evacuate her infant son from a building we needed to secure for strategic reasons. She was unarmed, posed no threat, and was clearly attempting to preserve innocent life rather than resist our operations. But she was in our way, and eliminating obstacles was part of our function. I put a single bolt round through her center mass and continued advancing without breaking stride. The infant died in the subsequent explosion when Brother Garavas used frag grenades to clear the rest of the building. I felt nothing, no regret, no guilt, no sense that I had committed an act worthy of moral consideration. The woman had been a tactical problem requiring a tactical solution. Her death served the Emperor's interests by allowing us to complete our mission more efficiently. The infant had been an acceptable casualty in service of the greater strategic objective. These were facts, not tragedies. But that night, during the meditation period that followed every combat operation, I found myself trying to remember what the woman had looked like. Not for any emotional reason, but because I realized I could not form a clear image of her face, even though I had killed her less than 6 hours earlier. She had been human, female, approximately 30 standard years in age. But beyond those basic tactical details, she had not registered as worthy of memory. She had been an obstacle, nothing more. This troubled me, not because I felt guilt about her death, but because it suggested that my conditioning might be interfering with my ability to process tactical intelligence. If I could not remember the faces of enemies I had killed, how could I be sure I wasn't overlooking important details that might prove relevant to future operations? If civilians had become so abstract in my perception that I could not distinguish one from another, how could I accurately assess compliance levels or identify potential resistance leaders? I brought these concerns to Chaplain Mauricus during my next confession session. He listened to my report with the mechanical attention that all chaplains brought to matters of spiritual maintenance, then informed me that my observations were evidence of successful conditioning rather than cause for concern. The ability to eliminate obstacles without emotional interference was precisely what the chapter required from its battle brothers. The fact that I could no longer perceive individual civilians as significant suggested that I had successfully transcended the limitations of human empathy that might otherwise compromise my effectiveness. He was right, of course. Over the following decades, my inability to form meaningful memories of those I killed proved strategically valuable in countless operations. I could fight through civilian zones without hesitation. I could make triage decisions without emotional bias. I could sacrifice squad mates when necessary, without the grief that might cloud tactical judgment. But it also meant I would never again experience the satisfaction of protecting something I cared about. Victory became a technical achievement rather than an emotional reward. Survival became merely the continuation of function. Success was nothing more than the completion of assigned objectives. This is the price of becoming an angel. You gain the power to protect humanity, but you lose the ability to understand why humanity is worth protecting. You become capable of great heroism, but you no longer comprehend what makes heroism meaningful. You serve the greatest cause in human history, yet cannot remember why that cause matters to those whose lives depend on your service. The centuries passed. Campaigns blended into campaigns until I could no longer distinguish one battlefield from another without consulting my mission logs. I was promoted to veteran after my first century of service, then to sergeant after my second. The Blood Ravens recognized my tactical competence and granted me command responsibilities, allowing me to shape the combat effectiveness of entire squads. I trained new battle brothers in the lessons I had learned: detachment, obedience, precision. By all measures, I was a success. My kill count exceeded chapter averages. My squads achieved objectives with minimal casualties. My tactical methods became standard procedure across companies. I had become exactly what the recruitment posters promised: a living weapon in service to humanity's protection. But success brings its own revelations. As I gained seniority within the chapter, I began to observe patterns in our deployment assignments that revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of our service. We were not primarily deployed to defend humanity against external threats. As the propaganda suggested, we were deployed to enforce compliance with Imperial authority, regardless of whether that authority served the interests of the populations we were sworn to protect. On Vos Prime, we suppressed a worker uprising triggered by the planetary governor's decision to increase factory output quotas while reducing nutritional allowances. The workers had not been corrupted by chaos or influenced by Xenos manipulation. They had simply concluded that their living conditions were unsustainable and that resistance might offer hope of change. They were wrong, of course. Our intervention ensured their lives became significantly worse, but compliance with Imperial taxation improved dramatically. On Morian, We participated in the pacification of a religious movement that had developed interpretations of the Imperial Creed differing from orthodox ecclesiarchal doctrine. Their heresies were minor, philosophical questions about the precise nature of the emperor's divinity, debated by scholars for millennia. But their growing influence threatened local church authority, and authority could not appear uncertain. We killed approximately 40,000 civilians during the 3-week campaign that followed, including the entire populations of 6 settlements that had embraced the heretical teachings. On Necroandanda, we supported Arbit's operations against hive gangs interfering with the collection of imperial tithes from industrial sectors. The gangs were brutal predators who preyed upon the weak, but they were also the only check on the corporate overlords whose exploitation of workers exceeded even imperial standards. Our elimination of gang resistance improved tithe collection, but led to working conditions so lethal that more civilians died in the following year than gang violence had killed in the previous decade. Each campaign was a tactical success. Each achieved its stated objectives with minimal expenditure of chapter resources. Each strengthened imperial control over populations that might otherwise have developed independence or resistance movements. Each served the emperor's interests by ensuring obedience to centralized authority. But they also revealed a fundamental contradiction at the heart of Space Marine existence. We were created to protect humanity, yet we spent most of our time killing humans who merely reached conclusions that differed from those of Imperial administrators. We were sold as humanity's guardians, but functioned as its wardens. We preserved the Imperium not by defending it from external threats, but by ensuring internal dissent never became rebellion. This realization should have troubled me, but it didn't. The conditioning that made me an effective warrior also made me incapable of questioning the foundations of my service. I could recognize patterns, draw tactical conclusions, but not evaluate them by moral standards that might suggest alternatives to obedience. I served because I had been programmed to serve, not because I believed service itself held inherent value. But even without emotion, observation produces understanding. And over time, that understanding coalesced into something dangerous. I was not a guardian angel protecting the innocent from monstrous threats. I was an enforcement mechanism, ensuring compliance with political structures that prized stability over justice, efficiency over compassion, and authority over individual welfare. I was not a hero serving a noble cause. I was a weapon wielded by administrators who had never seen battle, yet knew that violence could solve problems that diplomacy could not. I was not protecting humanity. I was controlling it. The 4th century of my service brought reassignment to the Death Watch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, tasked with eliminating alien threats to Imperial space. I had hoped this would restore the clarity I once knew during the Metallica 7 campaign. Clear enemies, defined objectives, simple solutions. Aliens were not human. They held no Imperial citizenship and no claim to sympathy. They could be destroyed without moral ambiguity, for their existence itself threatened mankind's survival. But even the Death Watch could not offer the clarity I craved. My first mission was the elimination of a TOE diplomatic envoy attempting to establish trade relations with Imperial worlds along the Damocles Gulf. The TOE were offering advanced medical technology in exchange for raw materials, an arrangement several planetary governors saw as beneficial, improving life for their citizens without reducing tithes to the administratum. The Ordo Xenos judged this a security risk, not because the Tau planned aggression, but because their success might inspire other Xeno species to seek peaceful coexistence. The Imperium's policy toward alien life was extermination, not diplomacy, and any deviation from that doctrine would be seen as weakness. We struck during a formal dinner, hosted by the governor of Pavonis. 43 TOW died in the initial assault, along with 17 human negotiators and 26 civilian attendants. The governor survived only because his guards had been forewarned, but he was later executed for treason, his corruption by alien influence, confirmed by an Ordo Hereticus tribunal. The operation was flawless. No TOW survived to report the incident. All human witnesses were silenced, preserving Imperial deniability. The diplomatic mission vanished from record, another secret success in the long history of sanctioned oblivion. But the intelligence we recovered from the TOW delegation complicated the narrative we had been given. The TOW were not seeking conquest. They were trying to save lives. Their empire was struggling to support refugees displaced by Tyranid swarm incursions. They sought trade, not domination, cooperation, not invasion. Their offers of medical technology were genuine. Their proposals could have reduced suffering on both sides, and we had killed them for it. That should not have mattered to me. The TOW were aliens. Their survival was irrelevant to my duty. Their destruction served Imperial interests. Their desperation did not change the necessity of their extinction. But for the first time in 3 centuries, I found myself questioning whether the completion of mission objectives truly defined success. Not out of compassion, but logic. The elimination of the TOW mission had indeed prevented contact, but it had also erased opportunities for intelligence gathering, strategic cooperation, and potential alliances against greater threats. It strengthened Imperial isolation, but weakened long-term survival. It preserved ideological purity, yet sacrificed adaptability. If the Imperium's survival was truly our objective, should we not value results over doctrine? If protecting humanity was the goal, should we not consider alliances that served that purpose, even with those once deemed enemies? I could not answer. The conditioning that defined me forbade pursuit of such questions. I could see contradictions in Imperial policy, but could not judge them. I could identify better tactical alternatives, but could not decide whether they were right. I served because I was made to serve. The fact that I no longer understood the purpose of my service did not free me from it. The fact that I no longer remembered what I fought to protect did not end my obligation to fight. The fact that I could question my own purpose while remaining unable to change it was simply another truth of what I had become. The final revelation came during my 5th century of service, on a world whose name I was ordered to forget the moment our mission ended. A world that does not exist in Imperial records, though it had once been home to 17 billion human souls. We were deployed there not to fight aliens or heretics, but to erase evidence of a failed Imperial genetic experiment. The Chatsu population had been engineered to create humans capable of thriving in environments too hostile for colonization. Lungs adapted to thin atmospheres, skin resistant to radiation, bones hardened for crushing gravity. The Adeptus Mechanicus had promised that such modifications would expand Imperial frontiers without costly terraforming. The project succeeded too well. The modified humans possessed enhanced intellect, disease resistance, and lifespans spanning centuries. They had become something new, something that might one day replace baseline humanity. This could not be allowed. The Imperium is built upon the assumption that human nature is static, that mankind achieved perfection during the dark age of technology, and any deviation represents corruption, not progress. These evolved humans challenged that core belief. If humanity could be improved, then perhaps Imperial authority itself could be questioned. The solution was absolute eradication. 17 billion lives burned away in orbital bombardment until the planet's surface turned to molten glass. No evidence of the experiment would survive. O-modified humans would escape to spread their genetic alterations to other worlds. No records would remain to suggest that the project had ever been attempted. The world would become yet another cautionary tale, a warning against the dangers of unsanctioned scientific research, and a reminder of why the Adeptus Mechanicus required careful oversight from the orthodox authorities of the Imperium. We were chosen for this mission not for our combat prowess alone, but for our conditioning. Where the Imperial Guard might hesitate, and where planetary defense forces might falter at the thought of exterminating their own species, we would not. Space Marines obey. We follow orders regardless of what those orders demand, for we no longer possess the human frailties that question such commands. The campaign lasted 6 long months, not because the enhanced humans could truly resist us, but because 17 billion souls take time to find and kill, even with orbital bombardment at our disposal. They had built cities deep beneath the planet's surface, hidden from our scanners, and fortified against the very apocalypse we brought upon them. They fought with a desperation unlike anything I had seen before, not the blind rage of chaos cultists, nor the mechanical precision of Tau warriors. They fought with purpose, with understanding. They knew exactly why we had come and what our victory meant. They fought not for conquest or rebellion, but for survival, for their families, for their children, and we killed them all. Every man, woman, and child. Every memory, every song, every achievement that might have advanced the human condition was burned away. We extinguished a civilization that had accomplished in 3 generations what the Imperium had failed to achieve in 10,000 years. Not because they were enemies of mankind, but because they represented what humanity could become. I was present for the final assault, the destruction of the last subterranean complex, where 12,000 civilians had taken refuge. They were unarmed, unresisting. Many were children born after our arrival, doomed to die before their first birthdays. The elderly stood beside them, silent witnesses to the extinction of their kind. They were not hiding when we breached the walls. They were not begging for mercy. They were singing. 12,000 voices echoed through the tunnels, melodies of love, loss, and hope, rising against the inevitability of annihilation. They sang not to survive, but to leave behind something beautiful, something human. And I killed them while they sang. We all did. Our bolters roared their own hymns, each shell finding its mark with clinical precision. One by one, the songs fell silent until only echoes remained, ghosts fading into the cold air of the dying planet. When the killing was done and the bombardment began, I stood on the command deck of our strike cruiser and watched the world die. Cyclonic torpedoes shattered its crust, while virus bombs stripped the soil of life. Within hours, 17 billion souls had been reduced to ash and magma. The planet was erased from all Imperial records, a world that officially never existed. The mission was a complete success. No evidence remained, no survivors escaped, no proof existed that humanity had ever dared to evolve beyond its ordained form. The Imperium endured, unchanged and unchallenged. But as I watched that world burn, something ancient stirred within me, something I thought had been purged centuries ago. I remembered the taste of my mother's bread, sweet honey and grain from the southern fields of Vidia Prime. I remembered the smell of morning air before the work bells rang, and the warmth of a life untouched by war. For the first time in centuries, I remembered what it felt like to be human. Those memories came unbidden, soft, fragile things that had no place in a mind like mine. Yet they persisted, lingering like the smoke of the dying world below. I realized in that moment what I had truly lost, not just emotion, not just compassion, but the understanding of why life itself was worth defending. The enhanced humans had died singing because they still remembered what humanity meant. Despite their genetic perfection, they had preserved love, beauty, and hope, the things that give meaning to existence beyond survival. I, however, had become something else, something that could destroy beauty without knowing what beauty was, something that could kill love without understanding it, something that could extinguish hope while remaining blind to its light. I had become the perfect servant of an empire that preserved humanity by erasing everything that made humanity worth preserving. But this revelation changed nothing. My conditioning would not allow it. I could recognize the loss, but not grieve it, understand the sacrifice, but never question it. I was incapable of rebellion, incapable of doubt, incapable of choosing another path. I was exactly what the Imperium needed me to be, nothing more and nothing less. Centuries have passed since that nameless world burned. The cycle continues. Deployment, victory, suppression, silence. I have killed millions, protected billions, and preserved the fragile stability of a decaying empire. I am a hero of the Imperium, a living legend, a guardian angel in armor, protecting mankind from the horrors beyond the stars. Children across countless worlds dream of becoming what I am. They imagine the glory of battle, the honor of service, the purity of faith. They do not know that I no longer remember why their dreams matter. They do not know that I have forgotten what it feels like to care, to believe, to hope. They do not know that in becoming their guardian, I have ceased to be one of them. And perhaps that is chaos's greatest victory, not corruption, but perfection. Not the destruction of mankind, but the creation of protectors so pure in their duty that they no longer understand the worth of what they protect. We are the Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's chosen, the shield that stands between mankind and the void. We are no longer human, and we have forgotten why humanity matters. Yet still, we fight. Still, we kill. Still, we serve. Until nothing remains of us but echoes of bolter fire and the fading memory of wars whose purpose we can no longer recall. We are angels without heaven, guardians without understanding, protectors without love. We are exactly what we were designed to be.